I can't believe we're reaching the last keynote speaker. It's a real honor to be here to present him. Professor Gonzalo Lizarralde, which some of you have already seen these days here at the Congress. He is the holder of the Université de Montréal Fayol-McGill Construction Research Chair in Architecture, the Built Environment and Sustainability. He is also the director of the IF Research Group and the Canadian Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Reconstruction Research Alliance. He is one of the founders of IREC, an international network of specialists in disaster risk reduction and post-disaster reconstruction. If you are not in this network, I think you should be there. It's really recommendable what they publish and the debate that is going online there. And I'll just leave the floor for Gonzalo, and thank you. We'll have some time to ask questions and debate after.
Is it better now? Okay, good afternoon. First, I want to thank Carmen, and I want to thank Raquel and Lorenzo. Where's Lorenzo? Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I have loved the conference. I've had a terrific time. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for putting up this excellent event and this very interesting conference. During the last 3 days, we have explored the concept of resilience, and we have thought about the tensions and trade-offs that this concept imply. This conference is going to deal with what happens when we don't get the alignment of resilience with other policies or with other measures. So this conference is about what happens when we don't get those alignments properly made. And my entry point is housing, low-cost housing in developing countries. I'm talking on behalf of a team of researchers from the Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Reconstruction Research Alliance in Canada that includes 3 universities. And I must acknowledge also a series of organizations in Canada, Quebec, and abroad that fund our activities. If you may click as well. This is the team that is working with me in issues of vulnerability, resilience, and reconstruction. And many of the ideas that I'm going to present today come from the work that these people have been doing in different fields, from geography, urban planning, architecture, and project management. And most of the ideas I will share with you today have been published in 2 books, 2 publications. One is Rebuilding After Disasters from Emergency to Sustainability, and the other one is The Invisible Houses. Basically, the idea behind these titles is that we face a series of problems that we largely don't understand, that we don't fully understand. We're today facing a series of challenges that we do not fully understand. And the reason is that some of those challenges have become invisible to the majority of us. Invisible because they're part of a city we don't usually visit or know about, or invisible just because we don't fully understand how these processes work. I'm talking mostly about informal construction and informal urban development. What you see in this picture is what was developed by architects and urban planners after the earthquake that destroyed the city of Port-au-Prince in Haiti in 2010. When the disaster happened, you probably remember, the National Palace was destroyed, the Presidency House was destroyed, and part of the city, a great part of the city was also destroyed. When the disaster happened, a series of experts from different countries, from the US, Spain, France, Belgium, jumped in and came to Port-au-Prince to develop ideas. One of those organizations was the Clinton Foundation, and the Clinton Foundation wanted to rebuild a model settlement. The idea was that this was the great opportunity to build something new. We will build something that will be a model of how we should built sustainably and in a resilient way in Port-au-Prince. And the Clinton Foundation invited a series of architects and urban planners to produce solutions to what was supposed to be the best reconstruction that had happened before. And many architects produced things like this. This is one of the houses that were built in a place called Soranje. Soranje is a few kilometers north of the downtown Port-au-Prince. And this is the type of things that happen. Architects, well-intentioned architects designing probably interesting housing solutions for the poor. But in reality, a few years later, nobody occupied these houses. Soranje became a deserted area. People really didn't want to buy these houses. There was actually no urban development with this, and they were just prototypes. Today, if you visit Soranje, you will find the failure of the Building Back Better program that the Clinton Foundation started in 2010, and many of those houses are not even occupied. Many other companies also had the latest, most innovative solution to solve the problem. Houses made of plastic, houses, Lego houses as they were called here, and a series of prefab, industrialized solutions that were supposed to be the solution for the reconstruction and the housing needs of Haitians at that moment. None of this really happened. This was just prototypes. Nobody really wanted to live in these houses. Nobody really bought these houses. They were just prototypes that fed the imagination of some entrepreneurs and innovators, but in reality did not produce a housing solution for Haitians. Instead, this is what happened. This was a totally inhabited place in the north of Port-au-Prince. This is called Canaan. Canaan was an empty land. Well, there were a few animals there, but nothing more than that. Before 2010. After 2010, there was the need to relocate settlers that had invaded a golf course where the rich people in Port-au-Prince play golf. So the idea was to create a piece of land that was of public use to relocate these people and create a camp. The camp started with 60 families. Then there were 200. People started flocking, people started invading land around. More and more people coming spontaneously to occupy this land. 2,000 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people. Today, some estimates say that there are 300,000 people living in this area. Canaan is the name of the place, is today a functional city. You will find a pharmacy, you will find shopping, you will find churches, you will find schools, you will find a clinic. It's a fully functional city. It's a very sprawl city, as you can see in this picture, but this is what in reality would happen. So you saw in the beginning what didn't happen, and I'm now telling you what did actually happen. This is Canaan today. So it became clear, at least to me, that we're missing something. We're not really understanding a series of things when we think about risk and when we think about resilience. And this is just another example of the type of things that have become invisible to us. Invisible because probably we don't really understand what's going on. This is actually an urban drainage. This is an urban drain. This is probably one day was a river, now it's an urban drain, so the water comes here. This is in the top of the mountain in Port-au-Prince, and this goes down to the ocean. This collects water, wastewater to the ocean. I know it doesn't look like that, but that's what it is most of the year. But in the dry season, once a week, women come very early in the morning, 6:30, 6 in the morning. And they start to occupy this place. In the wet season, this is water. But in the dry season, women would come here. And one would sell fish, and another one would sell fruit, and another one will sell clothes and oil. And you can buy a house here, and you can buy a car, and you can buy whatever you want. This is a fully functional market that works from 7 a.m. to 12. At 12, women start disappearing, and the vendors disappear, and by 1 or 2 p.m. in the afternoon, it comes back to be a drain, an urban drain. And of course, this happens because there is a series of factors in the economy, on the what we call informal economy, that we do not fully understand. What is pushing this woman in Vietnam to cut hair in the street, or what is pushing these women in Port-au-Prince to sell food on the streets, and why are people conducting these informal activities? So the idea of this work is to reveal how this economy works, to reveal how these connections, what the connections are between this economy and the way we understand resilience, and the way we understand cities, and the way we understand housing. And of course, more and more of our cities in the third world, in developing countries, are built in that way. According to some estimates, between 40 and 45% of cities today are built informally. That means that there is no planning, that means that there is no formal resilience plans, that means that there is no resilience paradigm coming to tell them how to build, and so on. What happens in reality is that people like these gentlemen build their own houses. And some of those houses end up being beautiful, as you can see in this picture. Well decorated in the front facade, with 2 or 3 story high. They are extended, and family come to live there. And there are income generation activities, and there is rent space, and there are a lot of things that we sometimes do not fully understand. This is the reality of 40–45% of the cities I'm talking about. And this is Mr. Muriel. Meet Mr. Muriel. Mr. Muriel is a construction worker in Colombia. Mr. Muriel, like many other construction workers, started his career as an informal construction worker. He was just getting whatever job he could, and he learned a couple of skills, and he started building informal houses. Until one day, Mr. Muriel developed this. Mr. Muriel is a very intelligent man. Mr. Muriel realized that building concrete columns was difficult in the traditional construction method. You would need to cast concrete in wood forms, and that becomes complicated. So he came up with this idea of casting concrete columns in PVC tubes. And this is basically what he developed as an innovation. He cut the PVC in two, and then he put a system so he can close and open it, and then reuse this form several times. He can use this 7, 8 times before being necessary to build another one. And he started using this in the informal settlements in Colombia where he builds. And he eventually built the most beautiful round columns in that part of the settlement. So Mr. Muriel eventually became very successful. People now want more of those columns that Mr. Muriel is building, because he builds the best round, perfect columns in town. And this is how Mr. Muriel is building the city today. Now, Mr. Muriel's son, thanks to the job that the father is generating with this, is going to the school in Universidad del Valle. And Muriel Jr. is now an architect. So now Junior architect is now partnering with his father, and they are eventually now working in the formal sector instead of working in the informal sector. Now Mr. Muriel and his son have contracts even with the state. This is one of the poorest sectors in Port-au-Prince. I must say that Haiti is the poorest sector in that part of the world. This is the poorest sector in the poorest country in that part of the world. This is called Cité La Joie. What you see in the back is the ocean, and this was built on land claimed to the ocean. This was debris that was put on the ocean, and this is where these settlers started building. And today, Cité La Joie has something about 1,000 families living there. So this is one of the poorest sectors in the world probably today. I'm going to show you another picture of Cité La Joie. Just to clarify, this is how Cité La Joie was built. You can see the time frames, and this is land that was claimed to the ocean, basically building on the ocean, and this is how Cité La Joie was built. And now, this is the picture I wanted to show you. This is a house in Cité La Joie. And if you can read a little bit of French, you would understand that this house is for sale. You would wonder, why would someone would like to buy a house in the poorest sector of the poorest country? Who would like to move to Cité La Joie? Well, apparently there's someone who might want to buy a house because this house, and not only this house, but many other houses are on sale. Not only in Cité La Joie, but in many of these informal settlements. So this raises a question, What is exactly that we're not understanding about this? What is exactly that we need to uncover and make visible about all of this? And this happens not only in Cité La Joie, but it happens also in Jumbo. This is Jumbo, an informal settlement in close to Cali in Colombia, where again, no, that was too fast. Go back. Yeah, where you can see this sign that says that the house is on sale. But not only the house is on sale, but also they sell ice cream and Coke, and they sell also phone cards and a series of things that produce income to the family that lives there. And one of the rooms is actually rented as well. So that produces a whole economy for the family who's living here in Jumbo. And instead, when we go and see the policies that we're producing, and when we go and see what administrations are doing, well, it doesn't quite fit this pattern that I have explained before. This is the type of things that we are building as low-cost housing in Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, and many other countries in the global south. This is basically a combination of subsidies, state subsidies, with market forces, basically letting the market, residential market, fix the problem by building high-story units in usually peripheral areas, because that's where land is cheap. And this is pretty much the model that we have perpetuated in many of these countries. And of course, this goes in a completely different direction to the patterns I have showed before. To give you an idea, this is what happened after Hurricane Mitch destroyed Choluteca. Choluteca is a small city in Honduras. When was Mitch? 1998? 1998. When Mitch came and destroyed great parts of Central America, in Honduras, there was this city close to River Choluteca that was partially, if not totally, destroyed. And NGOs again, and authorities came, and international agencies again came, and said, we need to build a new Choluteca. New Choluteca will be a model city. This will be a very resilient and sustainable city, and people were moved to live in Nueva Choluteca. And in Nueva Choluteca, houses were given by free to people that were living in these informal settlements in the old Choluteca. And people in Nueva Choluteca received a house like this one. Now, don't go too fast, because what is interesting about this picture is that there is no roof, there is no doors, and there is no sink, and there is no toilet. The reason being that people wanted to go back to old Choluteca, and they took with them roof tiles and doors and windows and everything to build back again in the slum where they were affected by the disaster. So we certainly were missing something important in this story. And this is one more picture of what happened in Nueva Choluteca. Buildings were built like this, and of course, nobody wanted to live there. People who moved there eventually lost their jobs. There were very few facilities. There were no infrastructure, and eventually people returned back, or a good part of the people returned back to the places where they were living before. And instead, what we have found is that in many places, and it's not really about building houses, it is about building infrastructure. This is Favela Santa Marta. Favela Santa Marta, like many other favelas in Rio de Janeiro, at one moment was threatening the beautiful landscape, the very scenic mountains that characterize Rio de Janeiro. So at one moment, the authorities really got worried. This was already too much for them. So they decided to create a project around. One of the bad things that were built was a wall around Favela Santa Marta. That's a shame. But instead, they also produced something interesting. If you click now, you will see, if you could click, this is what was built. This was basically a way of communicating the lower part of the favela with the upper part of the favela, and this eventually, as we studied, generated income opportunities for the majority of favelados. If you click another one, you will see what happened. A few years later, when we studied this case and when we conducted fieldwork here, what we found is that people were thriving because economic activities were now being incorporated. Well, those that were incorporated actually before eventually ended up being more productive. So people were starting selling sandals and drinks and whatnot. And then I'm going to show you in Favela Santa Marta the house with the blue window. You can see the blue window there. Now let's go inside this house in Favela Santa Marta, and this is what we discovered here. If you may click. Well, of course, no, the people living in this house were not totally poor. In fact, that house cost, guess, at that moment cost $60,000, which is what, 47,000 euros? Well, that's what at that moment cost to live in Favela Santa Marta. You can tell from my picture that, that this photo was taken maybe 10 years ago, maybe. But today, if you visit, you probably find several iPads and flat screens in these houses, and many of these houses in Favela Santa Marta. In reality, there was later on a gentrification process that occurred, and many of the people who stayed eventually got money or ended up selling their houses and moving to other favelas. And these processes of upgrading, of course, sometimes have successful stories and sometimes less successful stories. One of the successful stories that we can tell is the ones in Medellin, where eventually, yes, there were secondary effects and there were problems, but eventually the neighborhood ended up integrating relatively well with part of the city, with the formal part of the city. And of course, there are many controversial issues about this, but this type of infrastructure eventually helped link a part of the city that was extremely dangerous with now the more formal part of the city. And all of this actually happened. This is a reconstruction project that happened after an earthquake, again in Colombia. And there is nothing interesting about the house. Actually, if you can see this, there is nothing very particular. But what was interesting is that there was electricity very, very soon in the neighborhood. And electricity eventually led to Venta de Pollos. And Venta de Pollos eventually led to better income, not only for female family members, for women, and then eventually worked it actually fueled economic development for this part of the reconstruction, disaster-affected area. And of course, this doesn't mean that everything that is happening in the informal sector is good or well-built. No, it is actually extremely vulnerable to other causes. And if you click another picture, you will see this is in one of the informal settlements in Cali. This is called Siloe. I don't know if there are engineers in the room, but probably an engineer will quickly catch up that the column on the top is not supported in anything except a beam that is supported actually in a window. So, of course, if there is an earthquake today in Jumbo, this comes, flattens down like pancakes. But as well, there are a series of resilient initiatives and adaptive measures that people in these places are conducting. And this is this woman who has developed this sophisticated but at the same time simple system to collect water. You can probably notice that this is a Pepsi 2-liter bottle that has been turned down, cut, and this is the way this woman is collecting water. And this has become extremely useful now in terms of climate change, because as the dry season in this part of the country has become more intense, she can collect water that she later uses for domestic activities. This is Isabela de Sagua. This is Cuba. Cuba is in the front line of climate change, if you know what I mean. This is where all the hurricanes are passing by. This is where sea level rise is affecting coastal communities. And this is one of the coastal communities. Isabela is seasonally affected by tropical storms and hurricanes. And Isabela was destroyed a few years ago by yet another hurricane. And the government, the Cuban government, decided to, again, this is another one. This is Caratas, another village settlement. Yeah, go ahead. And this is Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz is living in one of these villages. He's a fisherman, as you can immediately guess. And when I met Mr. Cruz, I said, Mr. Cruz, why you don't want to leave this place? The government is offering you an apartment a few kilometers inland. Why wouldn't you move? He said, well, why would I move? I said, well, experts forecast that your village will be underwater in 50 years. And of course, he laughed. He looked at me and he said, listen, I'm 80 years old. And then he said something that I will never forget. He said, the ocean has never harmed me. People have. And that gives us an idea of how climate change is being perceived today in the front line of climate change. Because this is what the government is proposing to people like Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz is in a dangerous area. The government, well-intentioned maybe, wants to protect Mr. Cruz and many fellows like him, and they are inviting them to occupy these blocks, Soviet-style blocks, concrete blocks in inland, a few kilometers inland. And Mr. Cruz refuses to go to that place, and Mr. Cruz is not alone. He has gathered with a series of women like this one, and it's mostly women, who have gathered to oppose the Cuban government. Opposing the Cuban government is probably not easy, but this is what these people are doing. They are opposing relocation, and then they are claiming that authorities are doing an unjust movement by forcing them to relocate. And they are resisting, and this is their daily struggle. So this is for the problem. Now let's see a little bit of the solutions in the few minutes I still have. When an earthquake destroyed the agricultural area called Eje Cafetero in Colombia, many of the farmers that work in agricultural activities, coffee production, were affected in the rural area. Thousands of them were affected, like this gentleman here. He was deeply affected. His house was destroyed. And the Federación de Cafeteros, which is a guild of coffee growers, needed to act quickly. There was an impact in the economic activity of the region, and the guild really wanted to produce a solution for them. But the problem is that they didn't have enough architects or engineers or urban planners to develop projects. There was overwhelming needs of housing and infrastructure, and they didn't have enough professionals to conduct them. So they ended up producing an unlikely successful solution. They said, well, we don't have the capacity to build all these houses and infrastructure and all of this. So let's do something. We don't, by the way, we don't have enough money to buy a complete house. So let's give money to the people. Let's give them $4,000 at that time, 4,000 American dollars to the people affected by this. And let's see what happens. Of course, when they proposed that, it was a scandal. People said, forget it. They will drink it in beer. They will pay aguardiente with that. No way, that's never going to work. Forget it. But Federación de Cafeteros persisted and started giving money to people. And instead of giving the $4,000 in one single installment, the organization decided to give it in 4 installments. 1,000, I come, one of our engineers come and takes a picture to see what you're doing is really working, and then I give you another 1,000, and another engineer will come and take a picture, and so on until you complete your house. Well, years later, 14,000 projects were built. The woman on the top, actually the house was okay, it was the roof that was affected, so she replaced the roof, and $4,000 ended up being enough. The other case on the top, this guy his land was in the middle of a landslide, so he lost access to the house, so he rebuilt the access. This is called in Spanish a beneficiadero. This is where you will treat coffee before packing it to exports. So this is the case of a beneficiario that was destroyed. So this gentleman decided to rebuild it, and again another one that was working on infrastructure. This is another beneficiario. So in this case, the family didn't use the money for the house. They preferred to use it in something that produced money, of course, production activity. And finally, another example. This is Facatativá. This is another town, a mid-sized town in Colombia. And Facatativá, as many other towns in the region, is crossed by a river that floods every year, or almost. Every year there are 300 houses destroyed, and the year later it's 50 families, and sometimes it's 3 deaths, and sometimes it's 4 killed, and so on. This has become quite usual. At one moment, the mayor decided this is enough, we have to produce a solution. But again, the needs were overwhelming. He didn't have enough money, neither capacity to produce a solution for all these people. We're talking about 1,000 families that needed a solution because they were being constantly affected by floods. So he came up with an idea, an unlikely successful idea, if you want to click. He said, I don't have money to build a complete house, but I have money to complete half a house. So I'm going to build half a house, and I'm going to let people see what they want to do with the rest of the plot. But he also realized that what people wanted is not so much the houses. What they wanted was actually the jobs. So he said, we're going to produce a settlement that is dense and packed so that economic activities can thrive. And this is actually what he came up with. Architecturally, from the point of view of architecture, is maybe not a Pulitzer Prize, but let me see how it works. Let me show you how it works. If you click once again, this is how it works. In black is what the core that was built, and in the back there was a space for whatever people wanted to do on the back. People received a guide of construction attached to a policy. And the policy was, the guarantee actually, it was a policy of guarantee. And it said, if you respect disaster-resistant standards, you will keep a guarantee of your house for 5 years. And this is how you can build the back of the house. This is how you can build the rest of the plot. And 6 months later, this started happening. People very quickly started working. Again, another picture. This was the empty areas on the back where people were supposed to build. 6 months later, this is what was already going on. And a matter of 1 year later, this was already 2-story high complete structures. And a few years later, people started producing recreation activities. Others, if you click, started producing income generation activities. So this woman was cutting hair, and she had a saloon. Others were preparing meals. Others had a papeleria, and so on and so on and so on. So eventually, people generated income. With that income, they were able to invest in housing, and the housing solution was eventually solved. We know today that this idea of building half houses have been replicated by star architects that you probably recognize, like this one in Chile, with a relative success by, again, integrating informal solutions with the formal ones. In conclusion, these type of strategies permit an easier adaptation of housing solutions to individual needs. Actually, people have the freedom to decide what they want to do, and they do it according to their needs and expectations. There is also risk sharing among stakeholders. It's not one single institution in charge of building everything. It's actually shared responsibility between stakeholders. It gives transparency, or transfer of responsibility and transparency in that responsibility. It also provides better chances of dealing with the difficult challenge of collecting information. Who knew that that woman wanted to be a saloon dresser? Nobody knew that. Who knew that that guy needed a septic tank? Nobody knew that. Who knew that the other guy needed this particular roof? Nobody knew that. We don't have access to that information, even if we are the best architects or urban planners or engineers. We just don't have that information. They have that information, and they act upon that information to solve their own ideas. No, that was a bit too quick. Reduction of cost. As you saw in the Mitch example, people recycle things. People would recycle the sink. People would recycle the toilet, the doors, whatever. So if people are given freedom to use resources, well, they will also find the most efficient and less expensive solution for themselves. In conclusion, the real challenge of housing is not about houses. The real challenge of housing is not about houses. The real challenge is about creating conditions, and those conditions usually come with income activities, income generation activities, and infrastructure. But this requires thinking about social justice. This is about, eventually, social justice. It's about decentralizing decision-making power. It's about integrating heterogeneous institutions and including the informal sector, which remains the most powerful housing industry in the world today. It also requires a sustained engagement with all the stakeholders. So this is not about people are resilient, so we don't have to do much about that, or they can take care of themselves. This is people is resilient, so we need to work with them and engage them and integrate them in housing policy. And this is not about community participation. This is not the rhetoric about, oh, people need to participate. No, this is really transferring responsibility and transferring resources directly to people so that people can decide by themselves what they want to do. And of course, not every urban solution can be developed at the individual level. There is need for collective activities, and those require compromises, and those require trade-offs, and those require governance mechanisms. But if we combine those governance mechanisms for collective infrastructure with individual decision-making, I think we have better chances of succeeding. Professionals can improve living conditions of millions of people in the global south if we accept this engagement, and again, it's about engagement. Stop trying to simplify housing issues. The Haitian example was clear, I hope, and embrace the tensions that emerge and the trade-offs that are required in disaster risk reduction today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Gonzalo. I think he's been clarifying what we all, I think we have to assume that informality has different rules than the formal way we always think about. So I don't know if we can call it informal, but just another kind of formal ways of working that is all over the world. And another thing that I think is really clear of your talk is that when architects, and I really like the fact that we're again talking about architecture. We were thinking that we're very transdisciplinary, but I think it applies to everything. But architects, I think we tend to believe that we have the physical solution and it's going to change everything. That when architects understand the everyday life, they respond better to exceptional events. If we understand where we're working, we're context-based, I think this is part of the wonderful talk. But I do want to give the floor to anybody that wants to ask questions. So I can't really see the people above because of the lights. Sorry about that. If you have questions, please stand up. I think I can see you if you stand up, but if we can start, I don't want to take up the stage, so please. Yes, there's a question back there. I think there's microphones in the room. Could you please say your name and where you're coming from,
My name
please?
is Lucas Canho, Brazilian architect, a PhD student and a teacher of the University of Toulouse Architecture School. I would like to know if you believe that you agree if we are still teaching wrongly at schools, and not even, I don't mean only master, but I mean in the before master. Do you think we should change the way of teaching architecture and urbanism? Thank you.
I teach in a school of architecture, so I'm much aware of the complexity of teaching architecture today. There are so many things we have to teach today that it's overwhelming. We have to teach heritage conservation, we have to teach project management, we have to teach design, we have to teach construction codes, we have to teach structure resistance. It's overwhelming. And it's difficult to produce all those things in, 5 years here?
Yeah, 5 years.
4.5 years in our case. It's extremely difficult. We have more and more issues to deal with, but we still have limited amount of time and resources to deliver that. So I would like to believe that you're right, that you're implying that we need to make changes, but at the same time the reality is that there are so many things that we have to teach that need to cover the knowledge that is very difficult to focus. I guess we can have small changes. One of them is teaching, at the end of the day, teaching architects about ethics, because our work, much as urban planning work, is about ethics, isn't it? It's about social justice, it's about ethics. So yes, I guess we can change little things like that to produce a new generation of professionals that are more conscious about our responsibility with the environment, that are conscious with our responsibility with society, and that are conscious with the responsibility with the profession itself. So if there is a change that is needed, maybe it's in that regard, I would guess.
Thank you. And okay, Jürgen, and then. Can you pass the microphone, please? Thank you.
Yeah, Jürgen Rosmann. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think this is a problem we already are busy decennia and always facing the same problem. But one point I would like to emphasize, because you mentioned it also with your slides. Normally when we are talking about these informal settlements and so on, we, the professionals, are thinking in categories of housing. But housing is one aspect, but maybe even not the major aspect. What you showed is the people need to earn their living. Yeah? And in many cases, when we see those developments that are planned by professionals, they are planned with the idea to make houses, not to generate spaces where you can earn their living. And this is, I think, really a change we have to emphasize. For me, the very first time I saw really an interesting approach that was not in a developing country, it was in Madrid. In the 1980s, in Madrid, in the urban renewal in Madrid. There, an architect, I forgot his name, developed a housing type where he just generated spaces that could be implemented by the people themselves. They could make their business, they could make whatever, yeah? But it was an open space suitable to earn living. And as far as I saw, I visited this project several times, it was a huge success. It was a huge success on what you showed with this courtyard, where suddenly they made those tent or whatever construction. This is exactly the point. In fact, the starting point was the wrong typology, just houses in place of generating spaces that gives shelter on the one hand, but on the other hand also generates space to earn your living.
Thank you. Very interesting. I agree with you, and not only do I agree with you, but the policy, housing policy, reinforces that tendency, because usually housing policy segregates between residential uses and other types of uses, and most policies, municipal policies, for example, or national policies in the countries I was showing before, make a clear distinction between residential construction and other types of uses, and it's certainly wrong. You're a good point, yeah.
The gentleman next to Jürgen had a question. Jordi, if you could please. Just a minute so he can give you the mic, because the people upstairs won't hear. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah.
So you spoke of sustained engagement of all stakeholders and not just community participation. So could you elaborate further on that and how it can be achieved? Could you elaborate on that idea and how it can be achieved? Sustained yes. Engagement of all stakeholders versus just community participation.
Yes. I have colleagues worked with before who have studied precisely owner-driven reconstruction in India. One of the most successful, actually, urban owner-driven reconstruction projects have been developed after the Gujarat earthquake. When was that? 1990? I don't remember the date. And those are good examples in which, again, people were giving money installments, and they were free to choose on their own solutions and to act upon their own expectations and needs. And this goes well beyond the rhetoric of community participation, because it's not about a community hall where you ask people, what do you think about this idea? And people raise hands and so on, and at the end you do whatever you want to do, right? It's really about, well, I give you the money and I trust that you will use it properly. And if you don't, well, so bad. But there is nothing we can do, right? But it's about trust, and that trust goes way beyond a community hall meeting where you ask people, what do you think about this? should we paint it red or reddish? You know, which is pretty much what we do in community hall meetings and community participation, right? So it is certainly a step further, and I can give you links to the people who have developed this in Gujarat.
Thanks, Maria-Christine. Here, there's a question here. Anybody in the top wants to ask questions, please raise your hand so I can see you.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. Thanks for your presentation. It makes for a very compelling and strong presentation on the importance of how human beings occupy their territory. So thank you for that. And I want to hear you maybe a little more on understanding how people live on a territory where interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work can be done. So I'm wondering if, for example, you're working with social anthropologists, economists of development. So there's a whole bunch of people that are looking at and trying to understand how, for example, people that live on a land, it's more important to live where they live on the site. So the people that were moving after Hurricane Mitch, than being in a new house. And these people understand very much what are the social ties and why this is so important. So yeah, I want to hear you on transdisciplinary work.
I have suffered transdisciplinary work. I mean, I enjoy it, but I have suffered it in the sense that when we created the lab, we wanted to have people in geography and urban planning and project management and architecture and whatnot. And we totally underestimated the complexity of that. So we learned the hard way, and we just don't understand each other. For many years, we were not very operational because just translating what we were meaning by housing was 10 minutes, just that, you know. So we weren't very productive when we started doing this. With time, we learned to trust each other, but that takes a lot of time. I'm making this maybe too personal. Sorry if I am, but that is certainly how I lived it. I lived it the hard way, you know, when geographers will come and say, why do you want to produce solutions? Well, what do you mean why? This is my profession. That's what I do. Why you wouldn't like to produce solutions? It was like, because we study. And I was like, what? You study but you don't produce solutions? Only that took us like 2 or 3 years to understand. So he could understand that for me it was important to think a solution, and for me to understand that for him it didn't make any sense to produce a solution. But just that was a trouble in itself. So it's very difficult, very, very difficult. But again, sorry if I'm making this too personal, but we'll eventually learn that it was necessary. When he would tell me about the pressure of the state, at the beginning I was like, what? But then later on I understood, oh, this is what he means, and this is what it means in architecture, and this is what it means in urban planning. So it eventually became a conversation. We're now a little bit more functional than that, but yeah, it's very difficult, I would say, very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciated the way that you told your story through specific examples of reconstruction. And since it sounds like you have such a rich experience in working in this area, I wondered if you might comment on the different instances that you've witnessed or been involved in over time, and the way that the responses you've seen have reflected kind of cutting-edge knowledge in the academy, maybe in different disciplines, and then also as that relates to the development of transnational networks and social movements too. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that we have discovered with this work, and we decided therefore to launch a project on that, is that there are many common patterns. What the Cuban fishermen were telling us, maybe the words changed, the accent certainly changed, but it was not very much different from what the people in Jumbo were telling us, or the people in Medellin were telling us, or the people in Haiti were telling us. So a few years ago we decided that there was certainly something that we could start knitting together. We got funding from the Canadian government to create these dialogues. So today we have community leaders and municipal leaders coming into meetings funded by the government, in which we make them talk. We invite them to, they ended up talking. And saying, well, I'm living this problem, and the other city councillor would say, yeah, this is exactly the same problem we're dealing with. How did you deal with that? Oh, this way. So we're trying to do that. And the other thing that we're trying to do in that regard is to, in the same project, is to give money directly to women, particular women. We're following up what they're doing with the money. So we are providing resources directly for climate change adaptation to initiatives that are already implemented. So a woman is planting trees. So we give her money to increase her options of impact. And then we follow how she's spending that money to see what we can learn from that. And some succeed, some don't succeed, some disappear, some. And then another woman is teaching young kids about climate change adaptation. So we give her money, and we're trying to see how she is doing with that. And it's about, so to answer your question, it's a lot of trusting. It's a lot of trust to give the money, but trust that if we get together, we might have something to dialogue on and to complement each other. So these are things in which that require lots of trust, but somehow it's working, I guess. I can tell you more in a couple of years.
Yes, we had a question up front, or first. You had asked for the word, and then we can go there. No, I say this man here. Sorry. Please raise your hands up really high, because I can't
hello,
see
my
you.
name is Stefan Bartel. I'm from Urban Studio in Gävle and Stockholm Resilience Center. Thank you. I enjoy your talk a lot. I'm going to ask you a question now. I look from the city, from a systems level. And my question is it time to recognize the informal economy as a source of resilience in cities, especially for poor people?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess it is, but it comes with a but. I guess it is, but I guess we still haven't clarified what applies as an adaptive strategy in the informal sector and what applies as a just survival activity in the informal sector. I guess we need to clarify a little bit more those two things. At the moment, we're trying to putting too much, we're banking a lot on adaptive capacities, but I guess we are underestimating that many of them are maybe just survival strategies, and they lead to probably different trajectories. I don't have the answer for that, but I know that there is something I would be interested in working to see how much of that informal economy is really an adaptive capacity, and how much is just a survival mechanisms that leads to different trajectories that are not necessarily what we would understand as resilient. I guess there is a gap there.
Yes, could you please, that man in the back, please? Yeah, then.
Well, thanks. Is it okay? Yeah. Well, thanks for your presentation. I'm Kostas Lalenis from University of Thessaly, Greece. I agree 100% with your approach. I just have some questions about the role of legislation and the role of regulation. Why I'm saying this? Because, well, our experience from Balkan countries was that at a certain historical period, we had waves of people, refugees that were coming in. They had immediate needs. They built these neighborhoods that they had all these characteristics that you just said. Then times changed, and we had another wave of this kind of informal construction or illegal construction that it had to do with the extreme exploitation of land, that had to do with holiday houses in forests, with holiday houses in beach, We had the phenomena like Toki in Turkey. Everybody, well, whoever is dealing with illegal construction knows what happens with Toki and with the new, let's say, areas of illegal construction that all of a sudden they become institutionalized, legalized, and we have towers. Plus, we have the whole phenomenon of illegal construction getting in politics. In Turkey, they had 29 successive laws for legalizing illegal construction. In Greece, we also had this type of things. And in Balkan countries, we also do. They're the same things. I mean, the colleagues from Portugal, they also were mentioning about that. So, how do you perceive the whole thing? Because it seems like it is a very complex phenomenon that we have to examine separately the time conditions, the social conditions, the characteristics of the population, and of course, the whole concept, the political concept that illegal construction takes place. Thank you.
Since the microphone is back there, maybe we can have the two other questions, yeah, Mr. Santoso and Atsuki.
Thank you. Where should I start? Just like
Please
this.
make it brief.
Yeah, just like this. I agree almost every word what you said in front. But one word is, for me, is a little bit inconvenient. That is the word informality. Because, to my opinion, we should forget that architecture being confused through some other terminology coming from geography, economy, etc., etc. And you know that informality has something to do with the economic concept of thinking, you know, economy-oriented of thinking. To my opinion, we have to forget all that and started to understand that every way to shape the nature, to shape the, let's say, the artificial living environment, they have their own, what you call, right. Yeah? They have their own legitimation. Because every man born in this world has the right to live here. And every community has the right to shape their own environment in the way they're thinking that is the right way, and then also, of course, appropriate to their technological capacity. You know, so if we start from them, you know, then every different way to construct, you know, it has the formal or informal. It's not important. The important one is, do we give them the right to do that or not? You know, if we think that they have the right to build in their own way, you know, with the background, their cultural background, every civilization had their own interpretation about how to live in this world. And so I think we should put an end with this informality category. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Can we just get the one in front, Atsuki, and then I'll give Gonzalo time to answer.
Thank you for such interesting presentation. I'm Atsuki Ryokawa from the University of Tokyo, and is it more? And so I think it's very important to combine like informal measures like usual plastic bottle ones or like cheap columns one, and with formal measures by the government like housing policies. And sorry, so I think like the government's housing policies can even decrease the ability of informal measures like in the future or like in the future generations. So I was wondering if like is it possible to conduct such housing policies like by governments like very strategically, not to decrease or weaken the people's ability of informal measure, but enhance to people's ability in future generations. This is my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'll give Gonzalo time to answer.
Yeah, I would start with the second question on informality, because it's the most problematic one. It is certainly embarrassing that I use the term. It is certainly embarrassing. It is even embarrassing for myself. It's just that I haven't found another one. And I guess nobody has. Well, few people have the everyday things and non-pedigreed architecture, but the ones, those ones are still problematic. So you're raising a very good point. It is embarrassing, and it is even more embarrassing for me because I should have, for example, when I did these projects in South America, I should have known, because I speak Spanish, that informal, construcción informal doesn't make sense in many of those places. Just the translation doesn't make any sense. So I should have known better. Yet, in order to communicate in English, so somehow that's the word I need to use. But you're right, it's embarrassing. And in terms of, I will pick up your question from the point of view of regulations, because you mentioned that in particular. It's certainly very difficult, because if you increase, many cases have demonstrated that as you increase regulations for disaster risk construction, for example, disaster proofing, you also end up transferring a lot of people to the informal sector. Sorry again for informal, but so it's always difficult. But at the same time, you have to aim to certain standards of quality of living, of disaster protection. So it is complicated. But I guess we have to understand the positive and negative aspects of regulation, and its positive and negative overcomes in time as well. Yeah, and in terms of the capacities, you're certainly right that we need to reinforce local capacities. It's certainly something very important in the future. But for every good idea, there is always a political move that ends up hijacking it, right? And I'm afraid that lately, this idea of capacity building has once again been hijacked by economic and political elites for their own purposes. And the problem is that now several agencies and governments and people in authority are using capacity building as a way of once again reproduce patterns of control and power and things like that. But if we get rid of that and we think that in a more optimistic way, I guess you're right. In an ideal more ethical context, the more capacities people have, the better chances we deal with the overwhelming challenges we have today. So I guess in theory you're right.
I did want to give myself a chance to ask, and then I'll let you guys ask more. But you mentioned the role of women, and I strongly believe in that. And I wanted to ask you if you had found through savings, that's something that's ongoing in like the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, for example. Have you seen these kind of models in Latin America? Because I haven't, but you've been in much more places, because I think it's central to any kind of policies in post-disaster and post-conflict situations. The roles change so much, and there is an opportunity of creating a more gender-based solutions in risk. So I wanted to ask you this because it did come up that you were funding women projects.
Yes. I can tell you more in 2 years' time when we have finished our studies. But so far what we have started to identify, for example, in Jumbo, is that certainly it is women who start these initiatives. They will start planting trees and cleaning up the river and producing what we would call resilient solutions or solutions of adaptation. They certainly are leading many of those activities. But we have also found that if they don't succeed, well, they just disappear, right? But when they succeed and things start working well, there is a city councilor, male, often, who would come and again kind of see that there is an opportunity here, either to get votes or to have a contract with a contractor. So many of these initiatives that we see starting from the ground and let's say bottom up, eventually at one moment meet the top down and meet the municipality or meet the politicians. And at that moment, this is still anecdotic, but maybe it will become a pattern. What we have found is that many of these women who initially are leaders eventually get intimidated. When they have to go to the city council and all that, then they start, and in some of the cases we're following up at this moment, they eventually kind of withdraw. And it's a pity, because there is a potential there to work, certainly. Yeah.
I think we have time for some more questions. Yes? No? I don't know where the microphone is. Okay.
From University of Lisbon. Gonzalo, nice to meet you. Thank you for bright and very rich presentation. I would like to relate a little bit these questions and ask you to comment. How do you relate these conclusions you put there, how your kind of recommendations for the future, with the right to the city? Because you've spoken about the need to cooperate, to consider all the stakeholders and so on, and social justice. But how do you relate this with right to the city and to the right to another story, which is what they are making in Brazil, trying to implement the law of the technical assistance? I don't know if you know this, the legal framework in Brazil. They have, besides the usual right to the housing, which is part of the constitutions, well, at least democratic constitutions, they have the right to technical assistance, which ensures, in theory, technical assistance from architects and engineers to families with needs. So how do you relate these things? Okay, thank you.
I guess when Lefebvre launched the right for the city concept, he had good intentions in mind. He wanted to demonstrate that people are in a constant claim for space, and there was a moment in which it was necessary to clarify that. But I guess we know today that the city is made not only by people claiming space or competition, but also by collaboration. Many of these initiatives, I don't think they really fit into exclusively in Lefebvre's notion of competing for the city, because they are more about collaborating to develop something. So that doesn't mean that competition for the city doesn't exist. It does exist. But I guess we have also underestimated the collaboration for the city. You know, there is the claim for the city, but there is also collaboration to work on this. And these women fighting the Cuban government, does it really apply as a right for the city? I guess it's more collaborating to get something done and solution done. So I guess we have to understand these processes not only from the concept of competition, but also from the concept of collaboration. And again, the right for the city ends up being a mix between competition and collaboration, hopefully, I guess.
Because someone asked about, Lucas asked about the formation, the education from students. You think technical assistance is a better response because it's addressed to architects, what they are doing in Brazil. Actually, there are some architects who are trying to give training courses through the Conselho de Arquitetura e Urbanismo from Brazil, all over Brazil. Some of them were also competing in our Marielle Franco Community Design Award because they are doing that work, trying to disseminate technical assistance through the favelas in Brazil. You think that can be a good response to the needs in terms of assistance to these families?
I suppose there can be solutions that go from the technical point of view, but I think we underestimate the losers of innovation or the losers of technical solutions, because we tend to focus on the winners, right? The container houses that can be built in 2 minutes, and the construction, new concrete that can be casted in 3 days. But we forget that there are also losers of those changes. There are also losers from those technical solutions. So I guess there might be positive aspects, but also negative aspects, drawbacks, hidden agendas, other aspects that we tend to underestimate because we give a lot of value to technical solutions, innovation. So I guess the scenario has to balance between the benefits, but also the drawbacks and secondary effects of technical solutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Gonzalo. I appreciate everything. I think we've given him a lot of questions, but we did want to do now closing remarks. So I would like to ask my co-chairs to come up, please, the co-chairs of the Congress. Thank you again.